Mortgage costs, pensions eroded, despairing businesses. It's only been a week since Prime Minister Liz Truss and her Chancellor or Finance Minister Kwanse announced a new economic plan to slash taxes and boost borrowing in the United Kingdom. But what a week it's been. This is All 24 News special coverage. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm your host, Karim Zachary. And first, and before we delve into any debate, here's the latest. British Finance Minister Kwanse has made a U-turn on plans to scrap the 45p rate of income tax for higher earners. The Prime Minister said that the proposal had become a massive distraction on what was a strong package. The U-turn comes after the government's fiscal plans triggered a crisis of investor confidence, jolting markets to such an extent that the Bank of England had to intervene with a £65 billion bond buying programme.
Talk to people, we listen to people, I get it. We not only talked to people, we saw people's reactions, we were talking to constituents, we were talking to a whole range of stakeholders, and we felt that the 45p issue, the 45p rate, was drowning out a strong package of intervention on energy, a strong package of intervention on tax cuts for people generally, and we decided not to proceed with getting rid of the 45p rate. We're 100% focused on the growth plan, and I've been in Parliament 12 years. There have been lots of policies which, when government listens to people, they've decided to change their mind.
All right, let's bring in our guest now. Joining me live via Skype from the UK is Mrs. Pippa Catterall, Professor of History and of Policy, University of Westminster. And from Italy is Mr. Mark Lowe, expert on international relations. And later on, we will be also joined by Mr. Richard Toy, Professor of Modern History from Cambridge University in the UK. Moving on directly, gentlemen and madam, thank you so much for agreeing to be with us before asking any question. And let me start with you, Mrs. Professor Pippa Catterall. The UK government has confirmed it is abandoning its plan to abolish the top rate of income tax for the highest earners following a growing backlash. Chancellor Kwanse described the 45 tax plan a huge distraction. How committed do you think is Prime Minister Liz Truss to abolish the plan?
I think she's committed to keeping her job, and I think that's the main reason why she's done it. We know that she has had a urge to go down the road of the kind of policies contained in what, for want of a better term, we'll call the mini budget, since at least 10 years ago. So in 2012, she and Kwanse and several other people who either are or have been ministers in the current government published a book or a little pamphlet called Britannia Unchained. And lots of these ideas were already in there, with not a great deal of evidence to support the conclusions they came to, but the notion that if you do these kinds of things, growth will automatically follow because of you've got the macroeconomics right, is something that Truss and Kwanse seem to have believed in despite of any evidence to the contrary ever since they first came into politics. We had just now a clip showing Kwanse, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, talking about it's distracting from tax cuts generally. This is, of course, not true. Most people are not going to be having a tax cut as a result of what is happening with the rest of the package. What has happened, though, is that the public and indeed Tory MPs, who are the people that the Prime Minister is really responding to, have focused upon the 45 tax, but the rest of the programme remains deeply regressive.
Very nice indeed. What about you, Mr. Macro? Some British people believe that both the Prime Minister and Chancellor are humiliated with this. Some analysts believe that Truss's plan for tax cut is highly controversial. How much of a starting gate disaster is this, according to you?
Well, it certainly doesn't look very, very good for a Prime Minister to begin her tenure in this manner. Not good at all. Now, what we have to remember is the fact that right just now there is an absolutely massive, how can I phrase it, credibility deficit in the United Kingdom. The supplies to the United Kingdom in general, the supplies to government, the supplies to both the opposition parties and the Conservative Party. So potential for the situation to get worse rather than better, well, there's no lack of that at all. If we take a look at what happened, basically we have a decision that was made between the two individuals, a decision that wasn't presented to a cabinet, a decision that has been enormously contested, both amongst Conservative Party members, Conservative Party politicians, the general public, the financial sector. Basically, I don't think that other than themselves and those precious few citizens in the United Kingdom that would actually benefit from those tax cuts, I don't think there is any enthusiasm whatsoever. So to find absolutely everybody against you and to be forced into what is an absolutely humiliating U-turn does not bode well at all. So I don't want you to exaggerate in the least, but from what we have seen over those past few days, there is considerable discontent amongst the rank and file of the Conservative Party. There is massive discontent amongst the higher echelons of the Conservative Party. So I think Truss is going to have to be very, very, very careful how she proceeds. And just to go back to what Professor Catherall said earlier on, that her main focus is on keeping her job, that's a brilliant statement. I could not be more in agreement.
Very nice indeed. Back to you, Professor Peppa Catterall. Scrapping the top rate was not discussed with Truss's cabinet. It was Chancellor Kwarteng's decision. However, the latter indicated that it's Truss who initially made the decision on the U-turn. But then he said it was a joint decision. Either way, how does this leave them looking today? Can a Prime Minister sacrifice her Finance Minister just like that? Do we consider this as an internal problem?
Well, it tells you that the government really are not very good at communications. Truss has replaced a Prime Minister who, rightly or wrongly, had a reputation for being quite good at communications, good at coming up with three-word slogans like "Get Brexit done," "Oven-ready deal," those kinds of things, which may not have had much content or meaning, but they sounded good. Whereas it sounds like the current Prime Minister and her Chancellor can't even communicate with each other to agree their lines. In Britain, you have a concept of cabinet collective responsibility, which goes back hundreds of years. And the idea is that whatever you say in cabinet, you might tear strips off each other in cabinet in the secrecy of that conclave. But when you get outside into the public, you all have to be singing from the same song sheet. And clearly they can't, which suggests that Truss herself doesn't have the authority to communicate over her Chancellor and is not able to enforce her authority in the cabinet. Indeed, if she trusted her cabinet, she would have taken the mini-budget programme through the cabinet, which is, generally speaking, what has always happened in the past with these kinds of things. Now, of course, what she could do now is go, okay, well, the Chancellor has suffered a massive loss of political capital and credibility, which is starting to affect me. I'm going to stop the contagion and I'm going to sack him. Except he's a mate of hers. And if she sacks him, she'll be even more exposed herself. So whilst Prime Ministers have often in the past pushed and overruled their Chancellors and sometimes treated their Chancellors as little more than their bag carriers, it's not often been done by such a weak Prime Minister, despite the majority she has in the House of Commons, and it's not often been done in a way which is trying to save her own skin. So I'd just like to pick up something that Mark said as well. One of the problems you have is that she has no mandate for this kind of radical policy. Nothing's been put to the country to get this, let alone the cabinet. So it is quite, it's without a democratic mandate that she's proceeding. I don't think she's going to get rid of Kwarteng because I don't think she can afford to, but I will close my comments on this point by saying that chancellors in the past have been dismissed or resigned for far less. In 1947, the then Chancellor of the Exchequer resigned because he inadvertently let slip a budget secret just before he delivered it. Now we have someone who's the Chancellor of the Exchequer who we know was talking to hedge funds who have made a massive amount of money on his policies. Whether or not he was openly providing them with insider information, we don't know yet. But what we do know is that it smells awful.
Very nice indeed. And what about you, Mr. Mark Lowe? Following the U-turn, the pound has bounced back from its record low against the US dollar last week. How hard is it to calm the financial markets, according to you?
Well, I think that first and foremost, financial markets look for stability. They look for a government that is ahead of a curve, a government that has clear ideas as to how to resolve challenges, a government that is 2 or 3 problems ahead. What they want to see is economic stability, an increase in employment numbers, social stability. We don't want people out on the streets demonstrating. We most certainly don't want to see what Pipa has just pointed out, very, very importantly, which is yet another scandal inside government. This is not what financial markets want to see at all. So in a situation like today's, I think that basically to calm the market, you have to demonstrate that 1, you have a strategy, and 2, you're actually in control. And I think, unfortunately, as things stand today, the United Nations, beg your pardon, the United Kingdom's government is unable to demonstrate any of these 2 absolutely fundamental issues. So what is required is a show of capability and vision, and importantly, political support, which, as I think we both pointed out, is unfortunately lacking.
Very nice.
Well, I'll close here.
Very nice indeed. And now we are joined by Richard Toy, a professor from Cambridge University in modern history. Professor Richard, new Prime Minister Liz Truss and Finance Minister Kwasi Kwarteng reversed their controversial plan to scrap Britain's top rate of income tax. How has the response been now that this decision has been dropped, and how has the market responded? Do we say it's a temporary response, or is this part of getting back to stability for the Prime Minister?
Well, the pound has gone up again earlier this morning. I'm not watching it second by second, and of course each development has an impact on what happens, and I think that it's really quite a confusing situation, because within the last hour or so, Liz Truss has come out again and said that she would, in fact, like the top rate to be lowered in the future, although she's saying, well, I'm not thinking about that now. So, of course, this is sending very mixed and conflicting signals, which are bound to make the markets feel nervous.
And where does the UK government actually go from here to fix budget crisis, according to you, Professor?
where to go from here? Well, I mean, I think that they will feel quite lucky to get through to the end of the week without a major mishap. I think I think we're in a situation where Liz Truss can't really command the loyalty of many of her MPs. Remember that she was the second choice of the MPs, and then it was the Conservative Party members in the country who actually made her the Prime Minister. So there are a lot of discontented people around. She's also appointed many people to her cabinet who, essentially on the basis that they are loyal to her, and then that means that there are a lot of people who are not loyal to her, who are on the back benches and are now willing to speak out. And indeed, even within her cabinet, there are already some signs of dissent.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Professor Pippa Catterall? What is your comment regarding Professor Richard's answer here?
Well, I think in some ways she's quite lucky that the Conservative Party is currently camped out at their annual party conference. Not that it's probably the most happy of occasions this year from what I can see from some of the malcontented MPs' social media accounts. So she's not going to be confronted in Parliament, where she's not, let's face it, the best of performers. But the fact that the party is meeting there, if she has a really bad conference, if things continue to go badly, and let's face it, the tax thing was so such a bad move, such a faux pas, if you like, simply because it's done in the middle of a cost of living crisis. So when loads of people are fearing for being able to pay for their houses, being able to pay their energy bills just as we're going into winter, to give a tax cut to the richest people in the country, people earning over £150,000 a year, looks really out of touch and cack-handed. And that's one reason why that's attracted so much of the flack. But the cost of living crisis hasn't gone away. The energy cost crisis hasn't gone away. And all the evidence is that the Prime Minister has not only failed to understand these things, but she's misled the public on what she's done about this. And those kinds of things are going to continue to come back and bite her. So in those circumstances, I think this government looks like one which is committed to finding banana skins to slip on. And when they get back to confronting the opposition in Parliament in the next few weeks, the opposition will have a field day in attacking them all of this. Because remember, Parliament hasn't been sitting during all of these crises, which has meant that the opposition hasn't really had an opportunity to carry the fight to the government in the way that otherwise they should.
And Mr. Mark Lowe, Britain's new Prime Minister Liz Truss promised to unshackle the City of London to fuel growth, but crash in the bond market over tax cuts will take the shine off her big bang plan for financial services. How, according to you, will the UK population react to spending cuts?
It's going to be ugly. If there are radical spending cuts to unemployment benefits, if the very, very large number of British citizens depend upon the support, the economic support of the state, are put into conditions where a life that is already very difficult is made ever worse, then there will absolutely be repercussions. Now, none of us, absolutely none of us, want to make tremendous predictions or forecasts or suggest for a moment that there will be violent scenes. There will be, but unfortunately, this is one of those occasions where there is absolutely the potential for very, very serious civil unrest. If you touch the poor, then you're touching a very large number of people that are already in very, very dire straits. As Pippa pointed out, the cost of living crisis well, perhaps you can say that we're only at the beginning of it. We're certainly not at the end of it. We're not even anywhere close to the beginning of the end. We're at the beginning of it. Things will get worse. Those that have greater need for state support will continue to have an ever greater need. In fact, they will have an ever greater need of state support. If that is touched, then it will be very, very problematic indeed. Just close on this note. Again, people raised the very, very important issue of Parliament not having been sitting and the opposition not having had a chance to contrast in any fashion these proposed budgets and new policies. The opposition is in a rather lucky situation in the sense that within government and within the Conservative Party, there is so much rock and roll going on that the Conservatives are doing very, very serious damage to themselves. However, that said, looking into the crystal ball, I cannot imagine for a moment that although it might raise a few smiles to think of the Tory party fighting amongst itself, in reality, this is not something that the opposition parties are going to be happy about at all, because it is very, very much a recipe for disaster.
Very nice. What about you, Professor Richard Toy? UK MPs have signed a petition to reverse the controversial plan. Do you think that there is a possibility for them to go against Truss the same way they did with former PM Boris Johnson?
Well, I suppose the interesting thing about the fall of Johnson was that it wasn't actually triggered by any formal vote. It was by a sort of a mass resignation by ministers, which meant that in the end his government was really kind of unable to function and he had little choice but to step down. I don't think that we're going to see that again imminently. I think that it is going to be, I think we're stuck in a paradoxical situation where it will be quite difficult for Liz Truss to get to do what she wants. She'll find it hard to push her plans through, but as we've already seen, she'll be willing to do U-turns and to reverse course in order to avoid being defeated. Now, that kind of creates a situation where you've got a government which will be difficult to get rid of and yet has little actual power. So we might say it will be a government that was in office but not in power.
I saw you nodding right there, Professor Pippa. Do you agree? Do you want to jump in and add to Richard Toy's statement?
Well, I wanted to pick up on something Mark said. I mean, one of the problems with the present government is they seem to believe, from what they've been saying, that there are better paid jobs around the corner. And if they just create incentives, somehow or other, lots of people will move into these better paid jobs and they'll create more wealth. But unless you create the infrastructure, the wider supply side to do that, it isn't going to happen. So it's almost a kind of, well, we wish this would happen, but it's probably not going to. They also seem to forget that a large section of the jobs in the economy are actually in the public sector. Many of those are badly paid, but they still need to be done. So if they really want people to get better paid jobs, they could be paying people more money rather than constantly paying themselves, that is MPs, better and better money. The other thing I think, though, is I would absolutely agree with what Richard said. Johnson couldn't form a workable, credible government, so once all those resignations had taken place, until he agreed to go. I agree that we're not at that stage yet with Liz Truss, but in a remarkably short time, we're not far off. If the conference goes badly this week, if her leader's speech is poor and she's not considered to be a good speaker, then the pressure will continue. And I think we're in some ways at a kind of inflection point in politics where the events of the last week or so have impacted upon people's minds so much that they will remember this. So even if the government claws over this crisis and manages to hang on, this could be what we might call Truss's Black Friday. It was a Friday that the mini budget was promulgated. Perhaps it should be. Whether it actually will be seen as her Black Friday remains to be seen.
Very nice indeed. And Mr. Mark Lowe, do you agree with Professor Pepper? Are we going to see the government going against Prime Minister?
I think that there are a great many signs to suggest that Truss simply does not have the support that she needs to lead the government, to lead the country. I agree entirely with what people said earlier on, that it's not something that is imminent, but at some point in the relatively close future, Truss's hold of the prime ministerial role will be very, very much put in doubt. So I wouldn't exclude for a moment that at some point there will be some indication that she's either going to have to give up and make her way to the door through her own decision, or will be pressured into making her way towards the door. To avoid that, she has to become a leader. And that's going to be very, very, very tough. She's got off to a very, very bad start. And quite frankly, I don't have any, obviously I'm not the oracle, obviously I'm not following Truss's progress on a minute-to-minute basis, but personally I don't have any reason to be optimistic in regards to her future as Prime Minister.
Very nice. And Professor Toy, British Prime Minister Liz Truss said on Tuesday the government was looking at long-term energy contracts with other countries, but had not yet signed any contracts so far. What countries are we talking about here, Professor, and what benefits will the government have from this?
Well, I suspect that Liz Truss has got a record of talking up deals with other countries. This is true with respect to trade deals with after Brexit, where certainly she signed some, but not nearly as significant as she claimed. And so I would be frankly sceptical about the government's ability to do big deals which are going to make a real impact on the British energy market, because of course every country in the world is trying to do this, and I'm not sure that Britain is necessarily going to be particularly favoured. So I think it is just worth emphasising that it is an anxiety for many people how they are going to heat their homes through the winter, and it is the thing which Liz Truss has most emphasised in interviews. The BBC's political editor has been saying, he's just interviewed her, and he's saying that sort of every question which he asked, she tried to turn it back to the help which will be offered to try and limit household bills. And so I think that she feels that is offering some kind of safe ground to her. This is an enormous financial package, and trying to give people some reassurance that their bills will not be too high is probably her best talking point at the moment.
What about you, Professor Pepper? Do you agree? Is the British government going to deal with the energy file quite effectively?
I think that if the great British public were aware of how much more their energy prices have gone up than in other countries in Europe, they would be even more angry than they are now. One of the advantages the Conservatives have is that the British media is by and large so insular that they only tend to report what's happening in the UK. So most people are not aware of how much more incompetently this crisis is being handled than by President Macron in France or in Germany or whatever. So I think that's one thing. One might argue Germany's exposure to Russia is much greater than Britain's exposure to energy sources coming from Russia, and yet their energy prices have not risen nearly enough. One of the things that we're seeing is profiteering from the kinds of energy companies in which, curiously enough, Liz Truss started her career. But the other thing to bear in mind is that during the leadership campaign, Liz Truss went out of her way to say she was opposed to more solar energy. Now there are about 100 contracts to establish new solar power plants across the country, which would help to some extent. Most people in the UK do not realise just how much energy is now being generated by renewables. People often have a kind of lagging indicator of these kinds of things, so they tend to think that it's still as low as it was about 20 years ago. But solar energy, wind power has become much more important. She instead is putting all her eggs into the fossil fuel basket of fracking, which is probably going to take a long time to come on stream and would cause lots of other problems.
Very nice, Professor Pippa. I would like to bring in Mr. Marklow for the final question since we're out of time. How significant do you think is the gas shortage is going to be this winter in UK, Mr. Marklow, very briefly?
Well, two observations. One, and this isn't relative to the United Kingdom alone, but in terms of stocks, in terms of gas deposits, 87% and 90% of that which is required for the winter has been set aside. Well, yes, fantastic. The little problem is that if you use gas and oil resources that you have stored, you have to replenish them. So we go back to the concept that you raised earlier on. Where is the United Kingdom going to get its gas and its oil from? And I'll open a parenthesis within a parenthesis. All of this is greater impetus to the Scottish independence campaign, ridiculously from a certain point of view, but nevertheless, the Scottish concept of being in control of its own energy resources is something that's never gone away. So to close this parenthesis within a parenthesis, even greater instability in the United Kingdom, not good for the markets, not good for the country, and above all, not good for those citizens, and especially those that were not going to benefit from tax cuts.
Very nice indeed.
Stop.
Thank you so much, Mr. Marklow. Professor Pippa Catterall and Professor Richard Toy, thank you so much as well for your thorough analysis. And thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. We have reached the end of today's special. Bye for now.